Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for episode 10 of Typewriter Talks. I'm Maureen McDowell. I'm the founder and executive director of Keep St. Pete Lit. Typewriter Talks is a weekly online series where we interview local Tampa Bay writers to hear about their writing process and kind of get in their brains a little bit. And today we have Sara Ries. She is a poet. Yes. And we just wanted to kind of get inside her head and see, what makes you tick a bit as a writer, Sara. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Maureen, for having me and for this awesome new series. I've really been enjoying it myself. So
Good, wonderful. So tell us what you're working on right now.
I am working on a second book of diner poems. As you know, my parents owned a diner in Buffalo for 32 years. And so I really grew up working as a waitress and in the back kitchen. And just I grew up surrounded by these really interesting people. And so I just wrote my first book about it when I was in graduate school, and it got published soon after. It won a contest, a national contest. So that was about 10 years ago. And I never stopped writing diner poems after that first book came out. And so it's one of those books I keep going back to, this second book that I'm working on. And I always return to it. So over the past decade, I have been returning to it, but now I am just all in it. Like I am immersed in it, and I've been working on it almost every day. And right now I just have about a handful of poems that I am tweaking, and then I'll be ready to submit it. So I'm very, very excited.
Well, that's wonderful. So a first book wasn't enough. You felt like, is the second book kind of build on the first book, or is it different?
Yes, yes. So the first book was very much a celebration of the diner and its people and my hardworking family, and I do talk about tough issues in the first book, such as sexual harassment and almost like working yourself to death in a way. And this book gets deeper into some of those issues, those tough issues that I sort of just bring up in the first book. So this book there's a lot of death in the second book, because as you can imagine, a lot of those customers I grew up with, are now either very, very old or have passed away. And so this tells the story of what happened to some of those characters that I wrote about in the first book. Like there's old fat Joe and Onion Eddie and steel worker Mike, and yeah, the list goes on. But so it's and it also tells the story of how my family finally got out of the diner, and found somebody to take it over, really. And for the longest time, my family and my friends and relatives and I all worried that my father would never be able to walk away. I remember a friend told me when I was really young, a teenager, I think your father is going to die working at the diner. And that really hit me. And, so I always nudged my dad, you can't live like this forever. Like you can't do this forever. My dad was the only cook.
Yeah.
So, this is something that he really consumed him and our family. When we had dinner conversations, my parents talked about the waitress or the dishwasher or the customers who came in that day. So, that's where my brother and I went after school. That's where we went on Saturdays, so that was such a huge part of the family that I couldn't help but write about it for my first book. And it was a great realization when I realized that people were really interested in it, when I went to school for writing, my peers said, I want more diner poems. And I said, really? You want to read about that? So I just, I write about many other things too. I recently wrote a chapbook called Marrying Maracuya, a book of poems about my experience as a teacher and backpacker in Colombia. Mm-hmm. And I have a book, Snow Angels on the Living Room Floor. That's a chapbook about, I'd say, love and longing. Mm-hmm. So I do write about other things, many other things, but, it's inescapable for me. It's something I know so well. It's like ketchup runs in my veins. It's like the hiss of the coffee pot is, the rhythm of my heartbeat or something. And it's something I go back to, and it's something that I knew when the first book came out. I knew I wasn't finished telling these stories, and I knew I had a lot more to say. So
yeah, and until you run out of things to say about it, I mean, I think ketchup runs through my veins is a cool title. Just
thank you.
But I think that, I mean, I grew up in a restaurant too, and I still have to remind myself when I go out that I should pay. Like if I go out to eat, there's some part of me that like feels like every restaurant's my restaurant, my family's restaurant, or everybody.
Oh, sure.
So I get that actually happened this week, and I was like, don't forget to pay. Don't forget to pay. So
right.
That's cool though. And then you have a new child. He's 6 months old. So that's informing your writing process.
Absolutely. And I have several poems about my son, and I see that being a book too. And I'm already thinking like maybe by the time he can read, I'll have a book of poems so for him, as a gift.
So tell us about your writing process, because has it shifted now that you have a new baby, or do you feel more prolific? Or
I do, and I never thought I'd be saying that. It's against everything I ever, like it's against my logic. Like you have a baby, then you should be writing less, right? Because you're so busy taking care of this new life. But I just find myself writing more, and I remember when I was when I had a professor at Fredonia, a writing teacher, and I remember she said, I have 3 kids and I write more than I did when I didn't, have kids. And she said, I don't know what I was doing before, like how I didn't find the time. And I always remembered that, and I thought, how odd. And now I'm thinking of her. Her name is Amy. We called her Amy Nez, but her last name is Nezukamatatiel.
Oh wow!
So she said, just call me Amy Nez, but Professor Nez. So
yeah,
yeah.
Go ahead. Were you gonna say?
Oh no, I was just thinking that was yes, that it was like really those words like always stuck with me, and I'm just kind of like surprised that it's also like my story, that I'm like finding more time to write now than I did before.
Yeah, and I mean, like just being a parent and watching a child grow and double in size. Like you have a 6-month-old and he's doubled or in size.
Yeah.
It's such a fascinating process to witness, and it is like children can be a muse for you, and really correspond to major themes in life and bigger themes in life. And I mean, I have many poems that are about my child growing up, and I would never, I mean, if I hadn't gotten to be a parent, I wouldn't have been able to write those types of poems. So it's good though. And to say that, that, if there is a writer out there that's worried about becoming a mother or even a father, but typically the women take on the brunt still of the child work. But to, remind them that, you still feel prolific, and even more so. So that's important to share.
Right.
So you mentioned the diner poems, and you mentioned love, and you mentioned your time in Colombia. Do you have major themes that you come back to over and over again?
I'd say longing is something that inspires me so much. Longing and heartbreak. And I like to write about people, whether they're people in Colombia or people in India, or people here or in my hometown, or at the diner. I like to write about those interactions that surprise you.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, there's a poem that I was revising recently that's in the second book of Diner Poems, and it's called Lady at the Counter. And she always ate alone and always asked me a million questions, like, what do you think about when you swim? Because she knows I'm a swimmer, and just like, she just would ask me, like, what was your childhood like? Just like really almost personal questions. And I just assumed that she's the kind of person who's really lonely and would always like be longing for more company.
Yeah.
So there was this day I was eating my shift meal after my shift, and I saw her walking down the avenue, and I invited her in, like, oh, hi, come in and eat with me, we can hang out. And she said, no, I like to walk alone, and I'm in my own little world. And that was a surprise to me. So that's an example of writing about those surprising interactions.
Yeah. She had made a conscious choice to come and be social with you when she was in the diner, but she was fine.
Yes.
She wasn't there. Like, she enjoyed her own company. That's
yes. And I thought, oh, she's a woman who's walking alone. Like, she must want company, but I was so mistaken. And yeah, it's interesting.
So, what would you tell your younger writer self if you could give her a piece of advice?
My younger writer self, to not try to be cute or clever, that you don't have to be cute or clever to write a good story or write a good poem. To write what you know, and write from the heart. Write from the heart, and don't worry about if it's good or not, because if it's from the heart and you're really feeling it, it's going to make readers want to listen and read.
That's nice.
So
that's really good advice. I love that. So do you focus mostly on poetry? Do you do any prose at all?
I did write prose when I was in grad school, and I have found myself mostly writing poetry, or actually just writing poetry since grad school. Yeah. But I write prose poems sometimes. Yeah. So that's a way. And I do tell a lot of stories. I just much prefer the poetry form, because it feels so much more manageable for me. I tend to be very social, and I tend to be very active, and I tend to do a lot. And so I can finish that poem in a few sittings.
Oh, interesting.
And yes, and I feel that like prose would maybe take several pages and a lot more of my time, but it is one of my writing goals, is to return to writing short stories, because I feel that it's important for a writer to write in different genres and find your groove in that way, because I think that can help you be a better poetry writer. And and if you write prose, I think writing poetry will help you to maybe write a more poetic story. And so
I think that's interesting what you said about that. It fits more into your schedule, being a poet, because I've never heard that being said before. But for me, I love poetry because I can get so much out in such a condensed period. But we can get to the point. and I just think it's depressing. You're saying that because it works with your time schedule, and that's just, I mean, I think that's awesome though, because I haven't heard that said before.
Oh yeah, and it's something that I feel like I know, like I know how to do it. Like I know my rhythm of writing a poem. I know, so intimately because I do it so regularly. And I'm like, for me to write stories would be learning how to be a writer as a prose story writer, I should say, because I do write a lot of stories in poem form, but so I'd have to relearn how to find my groove as a prose writer.
But it's cool that, you know your medium. Like you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Like, you're driving a stick shift and by the sound when you need to shift. And I mean, that's that way you can focus more on the content. You don't have to work on so much the actual style of it. And you can kind of
Right.
evolve even further as a writer. You don't have to spend so much time learning form. And then you trust
Right.
yourself too, that's what's exciting about
That's
in it for a while.
Exactly. I do. I trust myself as a poetry writer, and but I always remember what a professor who was on my committee, my thesis committee, said to me in grad school. And he said, because we had to write prose too in the program, even though I concentrated in poetry, but he said, you're a great prose writer, really you get to you decide what you want to write, like that you have the skill to do it in both genres. So even though I don't trust myself as a prose writer, I always remember that. I think it's good to store compliments, like remember them, because writers tend to be really hard on themselves. I find that we can doubt ourselves a lot. We're so careful with our word choice and everything we want to say that I think we can also be really picky with ourselves and what works well. And so I like to store those little compliments that remind me, like, yes, I'm going to take that risk and I'm going to try a new avenue, and it's going to turn out just fine if I pour my energy into it.
Yeah, it's good advice for other writers, and also for your child. Just pour your energy into it,
Right.
I just visualized you having like a little compliment bag that you keep it.
Like pull from.
Wouldn't that be great if we all had our compliment bag?
Yeah.
I guess some people do, like, that they just pull the compliment out.
You're giving me ideas.
Oh goodness. So what are you reading right now? So who are some of your favorite poets or authors?
Yeah. So what I'm reading right now, I'm reading a book of work poems by Robert Licky, I believe is his last name. And actually, Maureen, you featured him at the studio, and he writes about being a plumber. And I really like to sit with his poems, and so I have it on my couch stand. And as someone who writes a lot about being a waitress, and his poems really speak to me. And I'm also reading James Baldwin. You had an extra copy, so I've been going back to that, Jimmy's Blues. And I also started Hillbilly Elegy. I've been wanting to read that for a while, and it's fascinating. It helps. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for a really long time, and it also helps. Supposed to be a good explanation for why Trump got elected, and I still have a hard time understanding that. But it gets into the heads of the very, very poor working class people in the Appalachian Mountain area, and so it's just a book that I've been wanting to read for a long time, and so those are my main books. But then I have a bunch of poetry books that I have with me, thankfully. I have a lot in Buffalo, as I always tell you. Like, oh, most of my books are in Buffalo, and I'm always like, but the ones that I like, my main books, poetry books that I like to just go back to, Kim Adonisio is like one of my favorite poets, and I just love her. I love her honesty, and how she writes about like the stark realities of life, and like the messiness of her, like her maybe crying moments or drunk moments, or those things that you might only tell your best friends. Like she writes openly about, and that inspires me to write about the more personal things, to make myself vulnerable, you know, in my writing. And so I return to her a lot, and I also return to Lucille Clifton. I just love how she can say so much in such a small space, and she tends to have short lines. I tend to have, I'd say, medium-sized lines, but I admire the shorter lines, and like saying so much in one line that you feel like you can move on to the next line. So I'm just so always so impressed with her poetry, and the another poet that I return to a lot is Mary Oliver. And I just like, she feeds my soul every time I read any one of her poems. It's all like soul nourishment for me. And she writes a lot about nature, but has a lot of those, I'd say, epiphanies in her work. In her poems, it's like every poem she has some grand realization or like feeling of oneness or something, you know. And so I try to achieve that in my poems, something that takes me out of like just that mundane story, and is that heightened something, that heightened like feeling or realization, or
well, that poetry does that really well. It kind of deals with the day-to-day, but then also kind of shows you the bigger picture of being alive. I think poetry that is well written, or that's the right way. That's not the right way to say it, but you know, you leave and you feel moved, or you know, or you gasp out loud, or you get goosebumps, or
sure. And I think that like poetry takes some digging, right? So you know, so when you spend enough time with it, I think you do get to that greater meaning that you're looking for, that says more a comment on the like our current situation, or the human nature or something, you know. But
I started a poem today about everything that's going on, and it was like, I feel like I need to write something, but I have nothing to write. And then the poem, like, it just totally took me on this whole journey where it just built on itself, where I ended up having something to say, but I had to start the poem with, I don't know what to say, because it's just like, like we're living in this science fiction novel where there's murder hornets, really, you know, like, and the whole poem took me somewhere, and by the end of it I was going like, holy crap, like. And I think that if you don't know to just jump in, you know, it's like you want to swim, but if you don't even get wet a little, you don't even have that experience. So it was really interesting to get that today. But you know, that was showing up at the page, that was writing, that was being present, and just being an explorer. I mean, I think that's what we do as poets. We kind of peek our head into something and like look around and see what we can find. And, you know, if we do it well, other people resonate with it. So that's exciting. You know?
Yeah. I look forward to hearing your poem when you're, and I like starting with, I don't know what to say. And I'm also working on one about the racial injustice and the current situation, and it's one that I am just going back to, and I can see it taking some time to, because it's so important, and I want to get it just right, you know, and it's so
even thinking about it just makes me like clam up, because it's so much. What gets you inspired? Like, what gets you unblocked? If you have writer's block, or you know, what gets your gears moving again?
Reading always does that for me. I just, you know, always I'm always reading poetry, and I you know, and sometimes just watching a well-written movie too, that will help. Also just movement too, going for a swim. We're both swimmers, so that will kind of get the creative juices flowing too. Also, just sometimes if I'm blocked, I just do it. I just decide I'm going to work on this, and it's going to be better than when I started. It might not be much better, but little by little, it'll be ready to show people, maybe, or maybe it won't, and that's okay too. But
I mean, even if you change one word, you know, you can do like that. You know, if you changed one word in a poem over like 2 weeks, the poem worked on. So that's a good attitude, especially people that are really busy, that they don't have a whole lot of time, and they think they need huge chunks of time to work on their writing. If you can edit in small blocks, and you can write in small blocks, and over a cumulative period of time, you're going to have a body of work.
Yes, I like to call it watering the poem. You know, I'll just think of my poems as plants, and I just need to give it some water, you know, help it grow a bit. And
I love that.
Yeah. And sometimes we have to trim the bad leaves, or the, you know, dying leaves, or, you know, the lines that don't add much, you know?
Yeah. And it may even be one day you get one part of a line, and then the next day the other part of the line becomes clearer. And just because I've said that before, like, you might not have lived the poem yet. So just writer's block isn't actually, that's what it is. It's just you haven't lived the poem yet to be able to fix it. So
I love that. Yeah, I love that, how you said that. Like, you haven't lived the poem.
So what would be your holy grail of writing advice?
Read all of your work out loud. I really sound is so important to me. I really love the musicality element of poetry, and so like, you can hear it if there's a word that is just clunky, and we know what sounds good. You know, we just know it's within all of us to understand that. And so to just keep reading it out loud over and over as you're revising, and that is important. And also fall in love with your words and what you're writing. And I think that it's so important to teach kids to fall in love with their words, read it out loud, and when we fall in love with language, we naturally want to keep doing it and writing more and more, and we just get better at it that way, you know? So
that's beautiful, to like fall in love with your own writing. It's funny to go back and, like, because my first book came out in 2006, so over, 14 years ago, and to go back and read it. And sometimes poems that I wrote like almost 20 years ago really still resonate with me now. And I feel like past Maureen wrote it, so present Maureen can get the information from it. So I think I like that concept of falling in love with your words. And, because if you're not in love with your words, why would anyone else be?
Right. Yes.
This is horrible. Read it. No, that's not.
Right. And And chances are there's going to be a line that really stands out, like that line that you just feel more than other lines. And then my other advice is to try to make all your other lines that good, or almost as good as that one line. Try to make it so you really feel the whole poem, and it, that, yeah.
So you want to share some work with us?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm going to read, I'll start by reading a poem called Fish Fry Daughter, and it's from my first book, Come In, We're Open. And in the new book, there's Fish Fry Daughter Returns. So these books are definitely in conversation with one another, and it kind of, second one builds on this one as I was talking about. But here's Fish Fry Daughter. And a fun fact, Ted Kooser, the former poet laureate, picked this poem to publish in his American Life and Poetry column in the paper, that was like published all over in newspapers around the country, and also it's on the Poetry Foundation. So it's like my one like rock star moment.
Yay!
If there are rock star moments as a poet, this was the poem. Yeah. So Fish Fry Daughter. Holiday in kitchen, the day I am born. My father is frying fish for a party of 17 when the call comes from the hospital. He stays until the batter is crispy, cold salad scooped on platters, rye bread buttered. Dad never told me this story. He told my boyfriend, one short order cook to another. Mom doesn't know why Dad was late for her screams and sweat on the hospital bed. Once, when she was angry with him, she told me, when your father finally got there, the nurse had to tell him to get upstairs. Your wife is having that baby now. I hope that when Dad first held me, it was with haddock-scented hands, apron over his black pants still sprinkled with flour, forehead oily from standing over the deep fryer, telling the fish to hurry, hurry. So.
Oh, I love that.
Thank you. And I brought a poem from my second collection. It's called Come In, We're Still Open. So, and this is about a dream I had recently, about a couple months ago, when the whole country was in lockdown. And it was a dream where I was back at the diner. My parents were still running the diner. And even though all of the restaurants around the country were like closed for dining in, the diner was open and everyone was wearing face masks. So this is about that dream. So, come in, we're still open, says the sign in our diner's window during the pandemic when dining in is banned. In dreams like this one, my parents still run the diner. Dad's at the grill, and Mom is convincing someone to order something sweet to live a little. Our diner is the color of blood or candy apples, depending on the light. And today, if dreams have days, it's sweet and blushing in a lace dress made of snowflakes, neon sign beaming a halo, beckoning its wanderers home. Duke and Country Joe are sitting at the counter behind my father, who's sawing through a stack of toast. Duke says to Joe, because the dead are alive in dreams, the diner is an essential business. It's why my heart still beats. The customers all wear face masks, and Mom and I can't jot down their orders fast enough. I thought I'd moved on from delivering number ones and 222s to the rhythm of sizzling bacon, grill scrapes, the hiss of coffee brewing, the ding ding of the register, another guest check pierced by the spindle. Steelworker Mike is at booth 7 with no sign of cancer, newspaper spread before him like crinkling wings. And when I pour him 2 cups at once, because his preferred temperature for coffee is the cool one, he looks up at me and says, they're dropping like flies out there. So.
Wow, what a cool poem.
Thank you.
Yeah, tie in the present and the past, and with people that have passed away also, and just the visual of the coffee, like he likes it cool, so you poured 2 cups, and knew that about him because he comes in regularly, and lovely. They're dropping like. Thank you. Thank you,
of course.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your writing, and thank you for all your wise tips for everyone. There was a lot of advice that you gave that we haven't heard before, and that's why we like to have this series, so people can kind of see that there's not one right way to be a writer. There's multiple ways, and even if you are a prose writer, Sara, as a poet, has tips that you can apply to your writing. So even if you're watching and you see someone is just a poet or just a prose writer, I recommend watching all these, because we're all writers, and we're all like, learning how to live this life that with this very peculiar, sometimes extremely solitary calling. So thank you for being here. We'll be here next week with episode, I believe, 11, and we are Keep St. Pete Lit. You can go to keepstpetelit.org. We have online writing classes. We have meetups for poets and writers, and all kinds of, we're on all the medias. So once again, Sara, thank you so much for being here. And everyone, will see you next week.
Thanks, Maureen.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.